rhythm. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Rhythm is one of the most important concepts in boxing, and most people will agree on that. What they can't agree on is a definition, or they can't tell you one, right? There's a few reasons for that. One is that it's just a very elusive concept, but more often it's that it's an aggregate of things, which is why I've written 5 different terms underneath rhythm on this board here. I want you to understand that this is not the totality of what rhythm comprises. However, these are some main ones and probably some of the most fundamental ones, right? So we have weight distribution, balance, timing, half beats, and range. And you will see as I demonstrate from beginner to advanced, drill to understand and incorporate rhythm, how these all connect to each other to integrate to form the general concept, and a concept that you will use throughout your boxing journey, right? It's not often taught because it's such an elusive and vague concept that more often coaches will tell you you'll learn rhythm as you get better, which is true, but that's a very passive process, right? It's more like as your general performance metrics get better, your rhythm will improve. But if we can take a beginner and now give them a drill that is scalable from beginner to advanced, they can begin their fundamental understanding of rhythm and integrate it throughout their boxing journey. I think this drill that I'm about to show you explains that quite aptly. So let's get started. Where do we start? We start with the most common type of rhythm, right? Or the most common rhythm that people will have, right? Almost every fighter will use this rhythm once in a while. You especially see it in the amateurs, but you'll see it in the pros too. And it explains all these concepts, right? What that is what I demonstrated at the beginning. The 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, right? A very bouncy 1, 2 rhythm. This is fundamentally the same as a shuffly 1, 2, right? Guys who are like this, which you see very often, either in the pros when they're conserving energy and they're at range, or in the amateurs because they haven't quite mastered how to do more complex footwork yet, right? Just understand there are nuanced differences to this that I'll explain later, but fundamentally these are the same concepts for purposes that I'm demonstrating here, right? So what are we actually doing when we do this 1, 2? Well, that's why up front, up at the top, we have weight distribution, because that's what we're doing, right? We're transferring our weight to our front foot, back foot. Front foot, back foot. Maybe it's 70% front foot, 30% back foot. Maybe it's 60-40. Maybe it's 80-20. Right? It varies. It's going to be more when you do the bouncy rhythm than when you do the shuffling one. And that's the main nuance that I will again explain later why that matters. But just understand that when you do a shuffly rhythm, your weight is not transferring from front to back as much. It still is, but not as much as when you do a more bouncy rhythm, right? When you distribute your weight back and forth, you're affecting your balance, right? Which is why we have it next. That's quite obvious, but you can actually feel it because when you start learning the beginning punches that any good boxing coach will teach you, you realize you're much more comfortable punching when your front foot lands than when your back foot lands, right? It's a lot more awkward landing on your back foot and punching. It doesn't feel right, especially if you're throwing something like a 1, 2, right? Because you have to recover and you have to slide and you're catching yourself, right? Like you're ending your momentum, you're stopping your momentum, catching yourself, and then balancing, right? It's more of a balancing act. Whereas when you have your weight on your front foot, you're loaded down more. You're more connected to the earth. You feel squat. You feel centered, right? Your center of mass is more central. And you also have more range, which I have at the bottom. But understand that these could be in any order. It doesn't really matter, right? When you have your weight on your front foot, you have much more range. Because if I'm back, just simply by doing this, I change my range, right? Though my feet actually haven't moved, right? Just my torso and my knees and my hips and so on, right? All of this affects our timing because we come into something called half beats. A half beat is when you break up this rhythm somewhere in between it, right? It doesn't have to be this 1-2 rhythm. It's breaking up any rhythm, but for this demonstration, it's on the 1-2. So if I'm in this 1-2 rhythm and I want to break it up on a half beat, I'll do something like this: 1-2, 1-2, 1-2, 1, 1-2, 1, 1-2, 1. Right? It's not when you expect it, right? And if I have an opponent that is matching this rhythm, and I can go at the right time, I can get him to where all of these different attributes are in my favor, not in his favor, right? And that's what we're going to demonstrate with the drill, when to punch to take advantage of that, right? Because we don't just need to understand our rhythm, we need to understand our opponent's rhythm. And this is understanding how this rhythm that we're going to be doing with our opponent can be exploited to maximum effect. So, for this drill, we have the pendulum here. I don't want you to think about this as a head. It's a body, right? It's just center mass. It's just movement, right? You know, it looks like a head. It'd be a really short person, but just think of it more as my movement, right? So we don't have to punch just to the head, and it's just supposed to represent that, right? These things on the floor here, this is just because I have no friends, so I don't have a partner to demonstrate. These are just to show the orientation of my opponent's feet, right? Just so you know that that's about where his feet are, right? This especially matters for more advanced drills, but for now, when we're not going to the inside or the outside, it's just a visual cue so you guys remember, right? I like to put this up here to help me train. You can use tape, anything. It's a good thing to use. So, when do we want to punch? I'm going to show you on the drill, and then, so you can actually understand the context of this drill, I'm going to explain to you what that represents in the actual fight, right? Because otherwise a drill doesn't mean anything. You just get good at the drill, but you don't know how to apply it, right? So, what we're going to do is we're going to get into this little push-pull rhythm, right? Front foot, back foot. 1, 2. Front foot, back foot. 1, 2. 1, 2. And I want to hit on the half beat. But where do I want to hit? I want to hit right when this is at the apex, right? The apex of the swing is the highest point that it reaches before it switches momentum. So if I want to hit it when it's at the apex, I have to launch my attack a little bit before it arrives there, right? So if this is as high as it goes, I want to launch my attack around here, right? And by doing that, if this represents 1, 2, 1, 2, this will be a half beat, right? Make sense? Good. Glad you're following. So, we get our timing. 1, 2. Front foot, back foot. And then we break it, right? And the easiest punch to do that with is a stepping jab, right? You don't have to have this swinging very far, right? So you don't have to do this massive swinging jab, right? You can just step, right, and increase it as you go, and eventually you'll be able to do things like double steps and 1-2s and even switch stance, use your new rear hand. You'll be able to do much more advanced things. But for now, I just want you to swing it a little bit. Get the timing. Feel this push-pull, front foot, back foot, front foot, back foot. 1, 2, go, right? So you're going when it's about here, just so it's right before it lands, right? And that's what you're going to practice. So why are you practicing that? What that actually represents for someone who's bouncing back and forth is the apex is the moment that they're as far back as they will be with their weight distribution and their distance, right? So that means that we want to launch the punch when they're about midway on their back foot, right? So if I'm in slow motion, this is as far as I go forward, this is as far as I go back, maybe about here, while I'm moving backwards, right? If I'm my opponent. The reason why we want to throw a punch at that moment is because that's the time where we can capitalize on all these things, and they're going to have the hardest time with it. we look at weight distribution. When they're coming back and they're just before they land and catch themselves, they're essentially in midair, right? They're essentially floating. They might not actually be in the air, like jumping, but they're weightless. They don't have any traction on the ground. They cannot launch an attack or protect themselves, right? They can't ground themselves. So they can't punch you, and if they get punched, there's no balance for them, right? So the first attribute, they're screwed. Balance, I guess that's essentially the same thing, but we can make this a little bit more complex or more nuanced. If I get hit while I'm on the front foot, right, I can attenuate the force by riding it back, moving my torso back, putting my weight on my back foot, right? So it lessens the damage, but also I will be able to balance, right? But if I'm already on my back foot and I get hit, there's nowhere else for me to go, right? I will trip over my own foot. It's a very bad time for me to get hit, right? We come to timing. They cannot time a punch, right? They cannot time defense very well either because they're at this moment where they don't have their footing, right? You see how all these things kind of connect in a chain, right? They don't have their half beat because they don't have their timing, because they don't have their balance, because they don't have their weight distribution. Then we get to range, right? They're back here. Their range is like this. It's not very far because, remember, they can't come out here. But we can because we've broken it, right? So we have every single advantage and they have none of it, right? So it's the perfect time to punch. And this timing, this fundamental rhythm, you will see it no matter what rhythm your opponent actually has. Because while you will probably recognize that you do see this quite a bit in the amateurs and this shuffling motion, even in the pros, when they're moving around and they're pivoting, maybe they're even switching stance, there'll be times where they'll come back to conserve energy and go 1, 2, right? Times within the fight where there's a lull. There's always going to be those times, right? But even if they don't do a perfect 1, 2, the concept of the weight distribution and the balance and the timing and the half beat and all that, the range, that still applies when they have their weight, front foot versus back foot and vice versa, right? So that's why this concept is very important to understand. It's integrated into rhythm as a whole. And just one thing I remember that I left out now. The reason why it's a little different if they're shuffling, right? They're not loading as much weight onto either foot, right? Their weight is more evenly distributed, so maybe it goes 60-40 instead of like 70-30 or whatever. So it's not as big as an advantage to push them off their balance and fuck up their timing and all this. However, we're compensated by the fact that because they're so slow and shuffly, we should be able to create a strategy around that compensates for the fact that we don't get to exploit this as well, right? Because they're just not as good at footwork. However, the concept is still the same. Instead of it being on this bounce backward, it's just when they land their foot. Or since the landing the foot, the back foot would be the apex, we're going to launch our attack right about here, right? Just before they land. And if they're walking backwards, it's right before their back foot lands, right? And that's the exact same concept. So that's what you build upon, right? And in the future, just a little hint, right, a preview of where this concept might go offensively. You eventually get to a place where you can start launching really sophisticated offenses like this, where I come to the outside of my opponent. I go in southpaw for that, just similar to what Mike Tyson did, although he also liked to do this to the inside, which is a lot more dangerous, using something called the D'Amato shift, right? We can also go into southpaw and launch our new rear hand, right? The opportunities are endless, but they're all based upon this fundamental timing, right? So understand this, and I would wager that if you just got good at that half-beat jab, you could probably beat most amateur fighters on their first fight, because I have never seen a gym that taught this to amateurs at that level in a way that they could actually integrate into their own training, right? And if they did, it was by accident. Like they didn't actually know that that's what they're doing, which happens often, right? You do something and then later on you find out the name and then you can start getting more advanced with it. But this is where you start, right? And then you can start thinking about these more advanced concepts as your understanding and your movement improves, right? So that's it. Hopefully that made sense. I'm very sweaty, and I hope you appreciate me writing this. That is actually all backwards, like the fucking Da Vinci Code writing and shit, because my webcam films backwards. So I had to spend like 10 minutes writing this backwards. Like, my dyslexia is just like, I guess it would be cured if I had dyslexia, right? It would actually be writing like properly. Didn't work that way, okay? See you later.